Just moments ago, inside the walls of Windsor Castle, Princess Anne, known for her unshakable resolve, was seen breaking into tears. Why? Because the one man she believed would never betray her, her own brother, King Charles, just did the unthinkable. For decades, Anne has been the embodiment of strength within the royal family. She was the steady hand, the iron figure who refused to show weakness, even in the darkest hours of scandal, loss, and public criticism. Her stern gaze and uncompromising work ethic made her the one royal least likely to falter under pressure. She was admired for her discipline, her refusal to play into dramatics, and her ability to maintain composure no matter the storm raging around the monarchy. But in this single moment, that unshakable image crumbled. Witnesses describe her eyes, welling with tears, her body trembling ever so slightly, signs of heartbreak that stunned even the most seasoned palace staff. For Anne, who had spent her life shielding emotions behind an unbreakable wall, the tears that fell at Windsor revealed not just sadness, but a profound sense of betrayal. The corridors buzzed with whispers before the truth could even spread beyond. The castle walls. Something had been done, something devastating, and Anne's reaction alone confirmed its magnitude. This was not a minor disagreement, nor a misunderstanding between siblings. No, this was something deliberate, calculated, and carried out by Charles without her knowledge. The staff who rushed to silence the growing chatter could not conceal the obvious. A fracture had opened at the very core of the monarchy, one that pitted brother against sister in a way no one could have imagined. Anne's rare display of raw emotion only fueled the fire. For years, she had been Charles's most loyal supporter, his confidant, the one who stood by him when others doubted his strength or questioned his choices. Unlike Andrew, whose scandals tarnished the family name, or Edward, who faded into quiet duty, Anne was steadfast. She embodied the loyalty their mother, Queen Elizabeth, had always demanded. That loyalty had never wavered, and yet it was that very loyalty that Charles had just crushed beneath his crown. Insiders revealed that for weeks, subtle signs hinted that something was amiss. Closed-door meetings from which Anne was excluded. Papers shuffled quickly out of sight when she entered the room. Conversations that ended abruptly when she approached. These signals, small at first, pointed to a larger scheme in motion, one she was never invited to be a part of. For Anne, who had always believed that her bond with Charles was beyond question, the sudden secrecy carried an unmistakable sting. The betrayal was not just about family, it was about power. Anne understood better than most that in the monarchy, trust was the currency that held everything together. Without it, even the most stable reign could collapse. And in that moment at Windsor, her tears were not simply for her own wounded heart. They were for what she knew this meant, that the crown itself was in danger of losing the very foundation it was built upon. Because if Charles could betray his most loyal sister, what else was he capable of? What would he risk to protect his reign, his image, his legacy? The truth was about to surface, and it was darker, deeper, and more dangerous than anyone dared to admit. But what exactly did Charles do that left Anne shattered, and why was the betrayal so much deeper than it first appeared? To understand Anne's heartbreak, we must go back to the quiet promise she and Charles made long before the crown sat on his head. From the earliest days of their childhood, Anne and Charles were bound together by a unique weight of expectation. As the eldest children of Queen Elizabeth, they grew up in a world where every word, every glance, every gesture was scrutinized. But within that unrelenting glare, Anne developed an instinct not to compete with Charles, but to shield him. Where others mocked his sensitivity, Anne defended him. Where critics whispered that Charles lacked the fortitude of a future king, Anne stood firm, declaring that her brother's gentleness was a strength, not a weakness. She became the unspoken guardian, the sister who refused to let the world consume him before his time. In the quiet moments away from the public eye, Charles leaned on her in ways few could imagine. The pressures of being heir to the throne were crushing. Yet Anne offered him something the courtiers could not: honesty without cruelty, loyalty without question. Together, they forged an understanding that would become their secret pact. He would always trust her judgment, and she, in turn, would always stand by him, no matter the cost. It was not written in ink or sealed with ceremony, but it lived in every look, every conversation, every decision they made side by side. To both siblings, it was as sacred as any royal decree. That bond was tested in ways that could have shattered it. During the turbulent years of Diana's marriage to Charles, when the press tore her brother apart and the whispers of betrayal grew louder, Anne did not retreat. Many in the family distanced themselves, unwilling to be caught in the firestorm of public opinion. But Anne stood her ground. She defended Charles's dignity in private and in public, even when she disagreed with his choices. She reminded him of his worth when the world seemed determined to strip him of it. To her, loyalty was not optional, it was absolute. The true depth of their connection became painfully clear after the death of their father, Prince Philip. Both Charles and Anne had lost the man who had been the backbone of their childhood. In that shared grief, they clung to each other, finding strength not in words but in presence. In those days of mourning, it was Anne who sat with Charles in silence, offering the one thing he craved most, without judgment. It was then that their bond, already ironclad, became something unbreakable, or so Anne believed. And so when betrayal finally came, it did not strike like an arrow from an enemy. It was not the sting of gossip or the bite of scandal. It was a knife from the hand she trusted most, a breaking of the promise that had carried them both through the storms of their lives. That is why Anne's tears at Windsor were not just about the loss of a title or the insult of exclusion. They were the tears of a sister who realized that half a century of loyalty had been swept aside as though it were nothing. And yet, the man Anne defended for half a century would suddenly pull the rug out from under her publicly. And without warning, the betrayal wasn't whispered in private. It was written, signed, and sealed in a royal decree Anne never saw coming. For a woman whose life had been built on service, dedication, and an unwavering devotion to duty, the discovery of that document was nothing short of devastating. Charles, without her knowledge or consent, had quietly drafted a royal decree that dismantled Anne's influence within the monarchy. It was not a rumor or a careless remark that could be dismissed. It was official, irreversible, and deliberate. For Anne, the words on that page were not just ink. They were the cutting edge of betrayal, carved with the authority of a crown she had defended all her life. The decree struck at the very core of what Anne had spent decades building. She was the patron of countless charities, the trusted representative of military institutions, the embodiment of tireless commitment. Yet, in one calculated stroke, Charles had stripped her of those roles, reallocating her influence to others, without so much as a warning. And the insult did not end there. Instead of allowing those responsibilities to remain within the hands of respected institutions, Charles reassigned them to individuals connected to Camilla's family. To Anne, it was not only a betrayal of her work, but a deliberate attempt to diminish her legacy, to erase her years of service, and hand the spoils to those she had never trusted. The revelation did not come through a conversation, nor a private explanation between siblings. Anne did not hear it from Charles himself, but rather discovered it only after the decree had already been enacted. Imagine the humiliation walking into meetings only to realize her authority had been rescinded, her voice silenced, her name removed from patronages she had nurtured for decades. By the time she held the decree in her hands, the decision was already law. The betrayal was complete. Inside palace walls, whispers spread like wildfire. Staff murmured to one another in hushed voices, careful not to be overheard. Charles chose Camilla over his sister. The weight of those words sank heavily into Anne's heart. It was not simply that her influence had been stripped. it was who had benefited in her absence. The courtiers and aides who once turned to her now found themselves bowing to new power brokers, individuals aligned not with Anne's lifetime of service, but with Camilla's growing reach. For Anne, this was the ultimate insult, the clearest signal that her brother had abandoned their pact and placed another woman above the sister who had shielded him for 50 years. Blindsided, excluded, and humiliated, Anne's tears at Windsor carried the weight of that discovery. To her, the betrayal was not only personal, it was political. It told her, and the world, that Charles was willing to sacrifice blood for influence, trust for convenience, loyalty for manipulation. What made it worse was the coldness of it all. No explanation, no warning, no chance to defend herself or to question the decision. Just a piece of paper with the seal of the crown and the power to erase her standing. The magnitude of that decree was not lost on those closest to the family. They knew what it meant. The brother-sister bond that had carried the monarchy through storms was fractured beyond recognition. If Charles could betray Anne in this way, there was no telling how far he would go to protect his reign. And yet, beneath the heartbreak lay an even more disturbing truth. This was not merely about governance. It was about rivalry, old wounds, and buried animosities that had finally clawed their way to the surface. But what could drive Charles to turn against the one woman who stood by him through every storm? The answer reveals not just palace politics, but buried rivalries resurfacing. Behind Charles's pen, many believe stood the hand of Queen Camilla, an influence Anne had fought against from the very beginning. The rivalry between Anne and Camilla had simmered for decades, long before the Keats crown was ever placed on Camilla's head. To Anne, the arrival of Camilla into Charles's life was not simply a love story. It was a disruption, a destabilizing presence that unsettled the family and cast a shadow over the monarchy itself. From the very start, Anne had regarded Camilla with suspicion. Where Anne valued duty, discipline, and sacrifice, she believed Camilla represented indulgence, manipulation, and quiet ambition. To Charles, however, Camilla was a source of comfort, someone who seemed to soothe the insecurities Anne believed he needed to face head-on. And so, the two women stood on opposite sides of Charles's heart and judgment, destined for conflict. Years of Diana's marriage to Charles only deepened this divide. Anne had been a silent supporter of Diana in her struggles, but she also saw how Camilla's presence undermined the institution their mother had fought so hard to preserve. For Anne, it was not merely about personal disapproval, it was about the monarchy's survival. Each time Camilla's name surfaced in whispers of scandal, Anne worried not for Charles alone, but for the crown itself. Still, Charles defended Camilla with a stubbornness that infuriated his sister. To Anne, it was clear. Camilla was not just a companion, she was a wedge slowly driving its way between brother and sister. When Camilla became queen, that long-standing tension shifted from whispers to reality. No longer confined to the shadows, Camilla's influence grew quietly but relentlessly. Anne noticed how her brother deferred to his wife in matters of court life, how voices loyal to Camilla began to dominate conversations once reserved for those devoted to the crown. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. The Charles Anne who had trusted her loyalty was no longer guided by his own instinct. His decisions increasingly carried the imprint of Camilla's hand. So when the decree that stripped Anne of her duties was revealed, it bore all the hallmarks of Camilla's influence. Those close to the palace remarked that it had Camilla's fingerprints all over it. Anne saw it not merely as Charles's betrayal, but as Camilla's victory. A calculated effort to sideline the one sister who had stood as the embodiment of loyalty, and to replace her with voices that aligned with Camilla's ambitions. For Anne, the humiliation was not only that her brother had acted against her, but that he had done so under the influence of a woman she had never trusted. Behind closed doors, whispers say Anne confronted Camilla directly. The exchanges were sharp, heated, and charged with years of resentment. Anne demanded answers, Camilla stood her ground, and Charles was left watching as the two most powerful women in his life clashed in open hostility. To staff who overheard fragments of these exchanges, it was clear that the divide had grown beyond repair. What stung most was not just betrayal, but replacement. Anne had spent her entire life proving her worth through tireless service, through loyalty that never faltered, through sacrifices few could comprehend. And yet, in the end, she found herself cast aside for a woman who had once been the subject of scandal and derision. To Anne, the crown she had defended had been twisted into a weapon against her, wielded not by Charles alone, but by Camilla's growing influence. And yet, Camilla wasn't the only force driving this wedge. The monarchy itself had shifted, and Anne's place in it was being deliberately erased. For Anne, duty was life itself. But in one stroke, Charles shattered her life's work. For more than 5 decades, Anne had lived and breathed duty. She was the one who shouldered the engagements others declined, who attended ceremonies in distant corners of the Commonwealth when no one else would, who stood in muddy fields and wind-swept ports, shaking hands and honoring service members without complaint. With over 20,000 engagements to her name, she had built a reputation as the hardest-working royal, the backbone of the monarchy's public face. To soldiers, to charities, to ordinary citizens, Anne was not just another royal. She was a symbol of commitment, a woman who gave everything for the crown and country without asking for praise in return. And yet, with the signing of a single decree, Charles cut all of that away. The honors, the charities, the military roles she had cultivated with care and relentless dedication were stripped from her in silence and redistributed to others. Anne did not lose a title. She lost the essence of her royal existence. For her, these were not ceremonial roles. They were proof of a lifetime of sacrifice, the very purpose that had carried her through years of loneliness, scandal, and relentless public duty. In one act, Charles dismissed it all as though her service had been expendable, as though it counted for nothing. To be undermined in such a way was not just painful, it was humiliating. The woman who had once been described as the monarchy's engine was suddenly treated as if she were an afterthought. Her decades of military patronage, her reputation for no-nonsense discipline, her loyalty to the crown had all been swept aside. And for what? To elevate others with less experience, less devotion, but closer ties to Camilla's growing circle. To Anne, the insult was sharper than betrayal. It was erased. It was as though her brother had declared that everything she had given her life to had no value. Those present at Windsor said her tears carried more than grief. They carried the weight of mourning. She was not only crying for the bond broken between her and Charles, she was crying for her legacy, the truth that everything she had worked for was being dismantled before her eyes. To lose her brother's trust was one thing, but to lose the meaning of her service was another. This was not just the theft of titles, it was the stripping away of her very identity within the monarchy. Yet outside the palace walls, something unexpected began to happen. While Charles believed his decree had secured his authority, the public began to turn. Whispers of sympathy for Anne circulated in newspapers and across dinner tables. Many saw her as the last true royal of duty, the one who embodied the old spirit of sacrifice that Queen Elizabeth had carried to her dying breath. In contrast, Charles's decision seemed petty, cold, and unjust. Public opinion did not swing overnight. But the tide began to shift, and quietly, Anne became a figure of admiration, not just for her service, but for her suffering. Her fall from grace, orchestrated by her brother, did not diminish her in the eyes of the people. If anything, it elevated her, casting her as the silent martyr of a crown that had chosen politics and manipulation over loyalty and honor. But while Anne wept, Charles doubled down, making a move that would set the palace on fire. Even Prince William, known for his restraint, was said to be furious when he discovered what his father had done. For William, the revelation cut to the bone. From the earliest days of his public life, he had looked up to Princess Anne not just as an aunt, but as the quiet backbone of the monarchy. While others faltered, Anne never did. She carried the monarchy through decades of uncertainty, embodying the relentless work ethic and stoic dignity that kept the royal institution alive in the hearts of the people. William often described her in private as the model of duty, the example he wished to follow in his own reign. To see her stripped of her role, cast aside with the stroke of Charles's pen, was more than just disappointing, it was unforgivable. Reports from inside the palace revealed that William did not stay silent. He confronted his father directly, and the conversation was said to be nothing short of explosive. William accused Charles of acting unjustly, of punishing the one person who had never betrayed him. He warned that the monarchy, already under the harsh eye of public scrutiny, could not afford to turn against its most loyal servant. To strip Anne of her influence, William argued, was to weaken the crown itself, leaving it fragile at a time when it needed strength more than ever. But Charles, resolute and unmoved, refused to bend. His decision stood firm, and his son's outrage only deepened the rift between them. In the days that followed, William turned to Anne, seeking her counsel, and, in truth, offering her comfort. Their private conversations revealed the full extent of Anne's devastation. She admitted to William that for the first time in her life, she felt dishonored, discarded like a relic, rather than respected as the lifeblood of royal service. Her voice, once steady with conviction, trembled as she confided that her brother had not only wounded her heart, but destroyed the meaning of her life's work. These exchanges left William shaken. He had known Anne as unbreakable, the Rock of Windsor. Yet now he saw her cracked, vulnerable, and betrayed. The effect on William was profound. He began to distance himself from Charles, aligning more closely with Anne in both public and private. Courtiers noticed the shift, and whispers grew that William's loyalty to the crown was no longer perfectly aligned with loyalty to the king. Instead, his respect for Anne and her sacrifice, her suffering, was shaping his stance. It was a dangerous development, one that widened the already fragile fault line between father and son. And though William tried to restrain his fury in public, those closest to him knew his anger was not temporary. It was the beginning of something larger, a quiet defiance that would only grow. The moment Charles dismissed Anne, he ignited a fire in William that could not be easily extinguished. For William, this was no longer about protocol or palace politics. It was about justice, about loyalty, about protecting the very values the monarchy was built upon. But while William burned with anger, Charles revealed the deeper reason behind his betrayal, a reason that left Anne speechless. Why would Charles risk breaking his sister's heart? The answer lies in a secret he tried desperately to keep hidden. Beneath the surface of the Windsor crisis, behind the polished speeches and carefully staged appearances, there was a truth Charles had guarded. Closely, a truth rooted not in necessity, but in fear. For years, the public had quietly admired Princess Anne's relentless work ethic. She was tireless, dependable, a royal who did not complain or falter. In an era where the monarchy was constantly questioned, Anne's presence reassured the nation. She was, in many ways, the living embodiment of the institution's promise. And it was precisely that image, admired and respected, that became Charles's greatest insecurity. Privately, Charles was warned by advisors that Anne's growing popularity was beginning to overshadow his own fragile reign. As he struggled with public doubt, health concerns, and the heavy weight of succeeding his mother, Anne's consistent devotion shone too brightly. Reports circulated within the palace that Charles's closest aides whispered of a silent imbalance, one where Anne was seen not just as the hardest-working royal, but as the one most worthy of admiration. To Charles, already sensitive about his place in history, this was intolerable. It was then, insiders say, that the decision was born. To diminish Anne's presence was, in Charles's mind, to strengthen his own. By stripping her of patronages, by reducing her role in the public eye, he believed he was consolidating the crown around himself and Camilla. This was not about efficiency or modernization, it was about insecurity. And it was not about family unity, it was about control. Charles convinced himself that Anne's star had risen too high, that if he allowed it to continue, he would forever reign in her shadow. The truth was made clearer still in a confession he is said to have shared with a close aide. His words were chilling. "I cannot rule with Anne standing taller than me." It was an admission not of strategy, but of envy. Not of policy, but of pettiness. For the sister who had defended him for half a century, the realization that her brother viewed her as a rival, not an ally, was devastating. When Anne discovered this reasoning, the pain of betrayal sharpened into something far darker. It was not just that Charles had broken their pact of loyalty, not just that he had stripped her of her life's work. It was that he had done so out of jealousy, out of fear that her worth made him seem smaller. To Anne, this was not only a betrayal of trust, but a betrayal of family. The tears she shed at Windsor, once rooted in heartbreak, now burned with the fire of rage. She could endure insult, she could endure sacrifice, but she could not forgive being punished for doing her duty too well. And yet, the betrayal wasn't complete, because what happened next turned Anne's heartbreak into open defiance. In the face of betrayal, Anne did not crumble. She rose. For those within Windsor's walls who expected Anne to retreat quietly into the shadows, the reality proved very different. Courtiers had braced themselves for her silence, for a withdrawal that would leave Charles's decree unchallenged. But Anne was no ordinary royal. Instead of bowing to humiliation, she stunned the palace by standing taller than ever before. Her refusal to step aside marked not just an act of resilience, but a declaration of defiance that shook the very foundation of the monarchy. The breaking point came during a military ceremony where Anne, stripped of many of her roles, still appeared, with her trademark composure. But this time, her words carried an unmistakable edge. In a speech that began as a tribute, she shifted tone with the precision of a blade. "Loyalty is not given. It is earned," she declared, her voice firm, her meaning undeniable. It was no slip of the tongue, no accident of phrasing. It was a message delivered before the world, aimed directly at her brother. Charles's betrayal had been done in silence. Anne's response was thunderous. The reaction was immediate. Veterans, officers, and ordinary citizens erupted in applause. Newspapers seized upon her words, framing them as a courageous act of defiance against a king who had overreached. Editorials praised her not only for her years of service, but for daring to voice what many were already thinking: that trust in the monarchy could not survive on tradition alone. It required integrity. In a single moment, Anne transformed from a sidelined figure into a symbol of resistance. Behind closed doors, whispers began to swirl. Some said Anne was prepared to step beyond royal protocol, to act independently in ways no senior royal had dared before. Others suggested she was quietly building alliances among those who had grown disillusioned with Charles's reign. Whatever the truth, one fact was clear. Anne's silence had ended, and her voice carried the weight of a people yearning for honesty, sacrifice, and strength. The fracture within the monarchy widened with every passing day. Where once the royal family projected unity, there was now a visible fault line. Charles on one side, Anne on the other. This was not a minor dispute, nor a private rift to be hidden from public view. This was an open challenge. A sister daring to confront the king not with swords or crowns, but with the truth he sought to suppress. And in doing so, she became more than his sister, she became his greatest rival. The betrayal that had once reduced Anne to tears had now ignited a fire that could not be extinguished. Her courage, her defiance, her refusal to be erased, these became a rallying cry, not only within the palace, but across the nation. Charles had sought to weaken her, but instead, he had created an adversary stronger than he could have imagined. And, just when it seemed the storm had peaked, whispers of Anne's next move threatened to shake the monarchy to its very core. If Charles thought silencing Anne would secure his reign, he was gravely mistaken. The decree meant to diminish her voice, had instead amplified it. Across the nation, the public no longer saw Anne as a sidelined princess, but as the true beating heart of the monarchy. Her decades of service, her refusal to complain, and her courage in the face of betrayal transformed her into a figure of quiet heroism. People began to whisper what once seemed unthinkable, that Anne, not Charles, represented the monarchy's soul. In a kingdom where trust had grown fragile, her endurance became the standard by which loyalty and strength were measured. Speculations swirled with growing intensity. Could Anne, even without official power, undermine her brother's reign from within? She did not need decrees or titles to wield influence. She had the respect of the armed forces, the admiration of charities, and, perhaps most dangerously, the sympathy of the public. Every speech she gave, every word she uttered, was weighed as a subtle act of defiance. Even her silence became louder than Charles's proclamations. To those inside the palace, it was clear. Anne no longer needed a crown to stand taller than the king. This shifting tide placed Prince William in an impossible position. He had been raised to honor the crown, to defend his father, and to prepare for his own destiny as king. But now his heart clashed with duty. His admiration for Anne, the aunt who had shown him what true service meant, pulled him in one direction, while the weight of his father's expectations dragged him in another. Those close to him whispered of his struggle, of long nights spent in quiet conversations with Catherine, torn between preserving royal unity and supporting the woman he believed embodied integrity. His loyalty was no longer absolute, and that uncertainty threatened to tear the monarchy further apart. Meanwhile, Camilla stood firm at Charles's side. Determined and unyielding, she defended the king's actions, insisting his choices were for the good of the crown. Yet behind the polished defenses, whispers grew louder. Courtiers spoke of a brewing rebellion within the palace itself, of alliances forming around Anne, of staff and advisors questioning Charles's judgment in ways they had never dared before. What had begun as a family rift was morphing into a political crisis. Anne's tears at Windsor became a symbol, a haunting reminder that the monarchy's most vital bond had been shattered. They were not seen as weakness, but as evidence of a fracture that reached the highest level. In those years, the nation saw the truth, that even within the gilded halls of royalty, betrayal could cut deeper than any sword. Trust, the very foundation of the crown, was broken, and with it, the certainty of the monarchy's future. The betrayal had changed everything. What was once secure now teetered on uncertainty. The crown that Charles had fought so hard to protect was no longer steady, its weight made heavier by the divisions he himself had created. And at the heart of it all stood Anne Defiant, wounded but unbroken her very presence, a reminder that his reign would forever be haunted by the sister he sought to silence. And so, as the world watches Windsor, one question remains. Can the monarchy survive when its greatest bond, the trust between Charles and Anne, has been shattered forever? Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.